Hello, and welcome to episode 118 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this afternoon, Bill?
I'm doing great. I hope our listeners know how much work it is to keep this cadence of one episode a week going, particularly for you, the historian, Seth. I'm just a color commentator here.
You're the John Madden of the
team. John Madden. Yeah, that's why they play the game.
It is a ton of work. It is.
Yeah, it is. And but I'm very heartened by the reaction we're getting from listeners and viewers. Some great questions.
Yeah.
And we were, just for our listeners, we are calling back our experts. I mean, Seth is the expert, but I mean, questions on episodes that John Parshall did. We get John's input in response to those questions that come up that people are entering on the YouTube page or on the whatever other page. So you do get an opportunity to re-engage with our guests by asking these questions. And so the guests seem to be enjoying it, and we certainly are too.
We are, and we get a lot of comments on the YouTube side of things, and those are answered by either Bill or myself. It's about 50-50, I think it is, about who answers what. Basically, whoever gets to it first.
Whoever gets to it first.
Is who
we try to be responsive.
Yeah, and I know we've probably missed a few here and there, and it was not intentional. It's sometimes things just slip through the cracks. That it is what it is. But
we passed 20,000 views, listens, and we're very grateful for all of the supporters for doing that. Obviously, this is a passion for us. We don't get compensated in any way. We get no advertisement revenue, so you don't have to listen to ads, and so it's remarkable that we've had that many views in the short time.
It is, and as you said, it's heartening to know that the work that we put in, and we did abundantly clear, we both do put in a lot of time in this. I think especially if you watch some of the videos and you see the pictures and the archival footage, and it's very clear that we're not just throwing this together. We're working on
Seth. It. Yeah, that's you.
But still, it's a team effort, and we're working hard on this, and I'm glad that people are enjoying it, because we enjoy doing it. If we didn't, I wouldn't be sitting here right now.
Exactly right.
But it is what it is.
Right. Our days are full. We don't need more activities.
Indeed.
Good. So what are we going to talk about this week, Seth?
Well, this week we're gonna dive into some more ship action, some gunfights offshore on Guadalcanal, and specifically
Guadalcanal campaign.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Battle of Cape Esperance. This is the second major surface action off the coast of Guadalcanal. And if you recall back in our episode talking about Savo Island, that being the first, it was a bit of a debacle, shall we say, for the United States Navy. This is our chance as the U.S. Navy to get a little bit of revenge on the Japanese. On the night of October 11th, 1942, the Japanese sent two separate task forces heading in the direction of Guadalcanal. The first task force was yet another troop/resupply convoy. The second task force, separate from the first, yet in the same area at the same time, was a bombardment group assigned to shell Henderson Field. The Japanese at this time, rulers of the seas around Guadalcanal, at least at night anyway, did not believe that an American task force would be in the area. Latest intelligence told them that the Americans were off to the north and were not anywhere near the beaches. Their intelligence was wrong. So, Bill, let's set up the stage here. We're in October 1942 now. Savo Island is, I don't want to say a distant memory, because it's the first thing in American surface commanders' minds. Eastern Solomons has happened. We've done Tenaroo River. Edson's Ridge is over with. The campaign is progressing. We're doing well on the island, but it's at the sea, on the seas. We're still, it's touch and go.
Right.
What is the U.S. Navy looking like at this time? What are we looking like?
Savo Island might be distant in the temporal realm, but in physical realm, geographic, it was well within view of the ships that were steaming in this area. It's right, they're in Savo Sound. The Tokyo Express is still resupplying troops and supplies to Guadalcanal because as we said in a previous episode, Emperor Hirohito has taken a personal interest in kicking the Americans off of the island of Guadalcanal. So this Tokyo Express is coming down the slot, is what we called it, past Savo Island in the Savo Sound, and essentially trying to land troops and materiel at the northwest tip, which is called near Cape Esperance on the island of Guadalcanal, which is where this battle gets its name from. Now, we had surface ships in the area, and the Marines were still struggling to keep deflecting the Japanese reinforcing troops. And the American Army decides, Admiral Gormley, who's still in charge at this point, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, maybe you need some help from the Army. And so that's kind of the introduction for this thing. The interesting thing, though, is the battle tactics of the day, even in 1942, were still derived from sailing ship tactics hundreds of years old. And so in the old days of sailing ships, of course, the ships sailed, I was going to say steamed, but sailed in a line of formation called a battle line, where the ships are in a single file. And that aided two things. The first thing it aided was communication between ships, because they would use signal flags primarily as the standard mean of communications. So you needed to see each other. So they would steam in a line, they would sail in a line. And the second thing it aided with is gunfire. Remember, in old sailing ships, whether it's a brigantine or a man of war, the guns pointed a beam outward, port and starboard. So if you wanted to, the most effective gunfire would be where your beam is kind of pointed at the enemy's bow or stern. So they can't bring their broadsides to bear, but you can bring your broadsides to bear. Now, if you have a line of formation, a battle line, where you have a bunch of ships in a single file, where all of those ships can bring their broadsides to bear against the enemy's bow, then that's called crossing the T, because the enemy is in the vertical line of the T, and you hopefully are in the horizontal line of the T, where all of the friendly ships can bring their broadsides to bear and destroy the enemy ships. Now, this makes sense in the days of sailing because you don't have to get your range right. It's not so important to get the range right on your gunfire when you're firing down in enfilade, which means you're firing down a line. If you fire too far, you're going to hit the ship behind the ship that you were aiming at,
right,
but you're going to hit somebody. So this enfilade fire is really important. Crossing the T was still a tactic in the 1940s because we still had battleships, cruisers, and destroyers with guns fore and aft. So in order to train those guns and not fire at your own superstructure directly aft or directly forward, you always wanted to gauge the enemy with a broadside, even in the 1940s. So again, battleship skippers and admirals in particular still use the crossing the T tactic, and it was the optimum configuration and battle positioning against an enemy who's also using guns to fire. So all of that is background, long-winded background, wasn't it, Seth?
No, but it's very, very important, because as the viewers / listeners will understand here in just a few minutes, that comes to play here. But just as you said, that was a tactic that really every Navy, whether they had carriers or not, and obviously, we and the Japanese do, but if it's a gunfight, that's what you want to do. You want to get that maximum, you want to get superior firepower, you want to, firepower advantage on that enemy. And the best way to do that is exactly what you said: cap that T, give the timeout signal there, cap the T, and you're getting all your guns, or at least the vast majority of them, on that enemy.
Yeah,
and
interestingly, sorry to interrupt, but if it's a destroyer torpedo fight, remember, destroyers' primary weapons were torpedoes, not their puny guns relative to a battleship.
Right.
Crossing the T is not a good tactic, because now you're trying to fire down the throat, your torpedoes down the throat of the enemy, rather than hitting the enemy broadside with a torpedo and have a better chance of hitting it. So if your destroyers, later we're going to talk about Leyte Gulf, trying to attack the enemy, you kind of want to be parallel to them, not crossing their T. But in this case, where the guns are the primary weapons, yes, crossing the T is the right tactic.
And this battle, in specifically Cape Esperance, this is a gunfight. I mean, yeah, there are torpedoes launched, but this is a gunfight.
Right.
This is a good old-fashioned U.S. Navy, Imperial Japanese Navy, shoot 'em up gunfight. And there's a huge difference between this and Savo Island. We were prepared for this one. So to give a little...
And we compensated for many of the lessons we learned at Savo.
Absolutely.
So that's really, really important. Go ahead. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, those are going to pop up here in just a few minutes. To give a little background on why this event transpired, why it even happened in the first place. As you were saying in the beginning, the Japanese are running resupply operations as often as they can to the island of Guadalcanal. As I said again, Edson's Ridge is over with. We've fought the Japanese along the Matanakaw River now a couple of times. The Japanese are building their forces for their decisive battle. With the Japanese, it's all about the decisive battle, their decisive battle on land, which is going to occur in a couple weeks, on land, what will be known as the Battle for Henderson Field. Anyway, they're bringing people, they're bringing supplies, they're bringing ammunition, very little food, but they're bringing stuff to Guadalcanal. And not every time, but almost every time they sent a large convoy, it was almost always at night, and it was usually protected by cruisers and destroyers. This is no different. This one is under the overall command of Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, and those astute listeners will recognize that name because he's the guy that came down to Savo on the night of August 8th and 9th and kicked the living crap out of the U.S. Navy with his cruisers and destroyers. Mikawa is an overall command of this operation. He's not at sea, but he's an overall command of this operation, and is set for the night of October 11th, 12th, 1942. His field commander, if you will, is a guy named Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, or Goto Aritomo, depending on if you wanted the American setup or the Japanese setup.
Right.
Goto's bombardment force is similar to what Mikawa had at Savo, minus one cruiser. So he's only got 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. And his job is to A, protect that convoy, B, really his main job is to go and shell Henderson Field. Now, the Japanese are doing this not every night. If you talk to Marines that were on the island, they said it was every night. It wasn't every night, but it was often. It was often enough for those guys to feel like it was every damn night. But this is going to be theoretically one of those nights where the cruisers and Japanese destroyers start lobbing shells at the Marines on Henderson Field. Now, American intelligence has picked up on the Japanese plans to build forces for an all-out assault on the airfield. We talked about this in the last episode with Dave Holland. Realizing that the Marines are hard-pressed to hold out against another massive assault, you mentioned this, the United States Army starts to get into the fray here. And let me be clear, is that not that the Army didn't want to go to Guadalcanal. I mean, and again, every soldier was not like, yay, let's go to Guadalcanal.
No.
but it was a matter of opportunity. It was a matter of resources. It was a matter of material. Could we get them there? It wasn't that we didn't want them there. It wasn't that Vandergrift said, no, the hell, stay out. It was quite the opposite. It was, can we get them there? Well, this is a time, and they campaigned that we can get them there. And the forces that are available are, let me get back a little bit. Knowing that there's another assault coming, the United States Army General Millard Harmon, CEO of the U.S. Army in the South Pacific, convinces Admiral Gormley that the Marines need some help, and they do. Let's be 100% abundantly clear. They do. The Army sends their 164th Infantry Regiment, which is part of the Americal Division, to Guadalcanal to reinforce the Marines ashore. The date for that reinforcement is set for October 8th. Now, this is really only the second time that the Marines ashore get any kind of major reinforcement, the first being when the 7th Marines and Chesty Puller arrive in September, and now this. To protect that, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is that my uncle was part of that Americal division that went into Guadalcanal. And so this bit of it has a very personal aspect for me. And so I've always been aware of the existence of the Americal Division, but I never understood why they were called the Americal Division. It was because they were formed. They're the only American Army division to be established outside the United States. And they were formed in 1942 in response to the Pearl Harbor attack in New Caledonia. So Americal is America Caledonia. That's where that comes from. And interesting, I remember being aware of the Americal Division during the Vietnam War when I was a teenager. And so I'm a child and a teenager, because my uncle would say, that's my division, the Americal Division. And I think that's an odd name. Why are they called that? And it wasn't until years later did I understand it was because of the New Caledonia connection. And true to form, my uncle formed up in New Caledonia and moved to Guadalcanal from New Caledonia. He had wonderful memories of New Caledonia, horrible memories of Guadalcanal.
I was going to say, I bet his memories of Guadalcanal were not so rosy.
Exactly.
Just to get a little bit off topic, talking about these guys, we're going back to the Marines here just briefly. Marines are fiercely protective of their legacy, and rightfully so. And I remember I knew a ton of guys who were in the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, a ton of them. And one of my good friends, Sid Phillips, told me, I asked him one time, and I already knew the answer, but this was for a video interview, so I wanted to get the reaction. I asked him, I said, Dr. Sid, I said, what did you guys think when the Army came ashore? Was there any kind of, animosity or rivalry? And he started laughing, and he told me, he says, Seth, he says, honestly, he says, we didn't care if it was the Little Sisters of the Poor, as long as they were carrying rifles.
Exactly. Well, I think another kind of funny point here, and you worked on the miniseries, The Pacific.
I did.
There was that scene in the Pacific where when the Army comes ashore, they got better rifles than the Marines. And so the Marines end up trying to steal Army rifles, and by the way, that's all true.
Oh, yeah. So, 100% true.
The Army had Garens, had M1s, and the Marines didn't. They carried Springfields. And fun fact, when I was in boot camp in 1974, the rifles we carried around were those, I think, 1917 Springfields. We weren't even, the Navy wasn't even rich enough to be carrying M1 Garens in 1970. At the Academy, we carried M1s, but in boot camp was the Springfields. But anyway, we're way off track. So we'll get back on track.
We'll get back on here. So the convoy that's bringing the 164th in has to be protected. Admiral Gormley assigns a cruiser-destroyer group under the command of Admiral Norman Scott. This is a name we'll hear several times, not only in this episode, but in future. Norman Scott to protect him. Scott's forces include 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers. And we'll get into all the ship names here in just a little bit. Scott's orders are to protect the convoy, and once the Army is delivered, which obviously they are, patrol the waters off Guadalcanal, intercept, and then destroy anything that attempts to move in. Pretty simple. Make sure those guys get there. Once they get there, shoot anything that isn't flying the stars and stripes. Admiral Scott knew that his mission carried with it 2 tasks aside from the destruction of any Japanese force. One was to develop a night surface doctrine. And this goes back exactly to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Bill, about the lessons learned at Savo Island. We had no nighttime naval surface doctrine. We didn't have it. And his job was partially to develop this doctrine either via battle or via training at night. His second task was, if he had the opportunity, to exact revenge for Savo Island. Now, he didn't go out there with the sole task of, we're going to, revenge. He was going out there to do a job, and his job was to sink anything that came out there. And if it turned out in their favor, yay, hey, revenge, here it is. As far as doctrine is concerned, Scott was aware that he and his units lacked any real experience at all or training in night actions. Therefore, his plan of action, should it be needed, was very, very simple. Scott was very, very in tune with his people. He was very in tune with his vessels. He was very in tune with, frankly, everything. His plan was to simply steam in a column with destroyers ahead in the van and his cruisers in the middle. That's it. And just steam in a column.
Keep it simple.
That's it, man. Keep it simple.
Simplicity is not the way the Japanese would come at a battle plan.
No.
Sometimes it's the best way.
Exactly. And this would be one of those times. Destroyers would illuminate any targets after radar contact. fire torpedoes and allow the cruisers to concentrate on the enemy heavy units. Simple, easy, easy peasy. Scott chose the USS San Francisco. This is the first time you hear the name of this ship, and it certainly will not be the last. The USS San Francisco. This is CA-38 heavy cruiser as his flagship.
The only heavy cruiser in this group, right?
No, there was another one. There's Salt Lake City.
Salt Lake City. Okay, that's
Salt Lake City was in there. Anyway, he chooses San Francisco, and this is where he's a little bit kind of wonky with his decision here, because pre-war, and Bill, you can attest to this, task force commanders are going to choose the larger vessel. And it's not necessarily because of stature, but I mean, a larger vessel can hold an admiral's staff. They can do a lot of different things that smaller vessels can't. In hindsight, which is of course 2020, they say he should have chosen one of the lighter cruisers, the Helena specifically.
Yeah, CL rather than the CA.
Right, and he chooses San Francisco because she's a bigger ship and she's got admiral's quarters. She's more appropriate for his staff.
That's right. And so she can, he has the flag communication staff, the flag navigation staff, and all those, and better communication equipment to coordinate all of this action that's going on with the other ships. The one thing it doesn't have is the better sensors. Exactly. And it's because of that, it doesn't have the better situational awareness. And so we can't plot the enemy ships as well as the light cruisers could, because they had a better surface radar.
Exactly. The radar that the Frisco had radar. Let's be clear. She had what was called SC, Sierra Charlie, SC radar, which was basically last year's model. Let's just put it that way.
Lower frequency, so it had better range, but it had worse discrimination when targets were closer together.
Right.
A better radar for close-in fighting was the SG, Sierra Golf radar, which the light cruisers had.
Right.
Helena and Boise.
Helena and Boise did have the SG. The SG was the hotness. That was the new stuff coming into the fleet right now. And the thing was, and this is key. This is key here, is that the United States and Admiral Scott were operating under the false intelligence that the Japanese actually had some radar detecting equipment aboard their ships. Where the hell this information came from, I personally do not know. I have no idea. But this is the thing. They thought that the Japanese had some sort of equipment that could detect American radar.
Well, honestly, though, Seth, that's not really hard to do because it's just radio frequency detection equipment. You have to be looking at the right frequency for the right type of modulated signal. So it is actually common sense. This stuff emits, and therefore it's detectable. In fact, it's when you do have radar detection equipment, they can detect the radar at twice the range that you can detect them with the radar, because the RF energy has to go out and back. It goes out twice as far as it goes back. So it was a legitimate concern, but it was bad intel because the Japanese weren't smart enough to know where to look in the RF spectrum to find this transmission and to use the radar itself to detect the presence of the American warships.
Right. And as a result of this faulty intelligence, Admiral Scott ordered that the radar on the USS San Francisco that could have significantly benefited the situation that's about to unfold, he had it turned off. He ordered it to be turned off. Actually, he ordered all of the radar to be turned off. Some skippers did not comply with that order, which is a good thing. This is a very good
nighttime, on a dark night, you're already blind, and to turn off the one sensor that might give you some sight and an advantage, this doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And if you can fault Admiral Scott with one thing, this would probably be it. But he gets lucky. So on October 9th and 10th, Scott was patrolling the area just north of Rennell Island. So this is, near Guadalcanal, but not in the direct battlefield area right there. He was cruising that area specifically to stay out of the range of Japanese search planes. He did not want the Japanese to know that he was there. He knew that if the Japanese were coming, that more than likely our search planes, either his or those flying from Guadalcanal or Espiritu Santo, would hopefully spot them before they ever spotted him. And that's exactly exactly what happened. On the 11th, search planes from Guadalcanal sighted the incoming Japanese troop reinforcement convoy and reported it as 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Now, again, faulty sighting, misidentification of ships. But the important thing here is that Norman Scott now knows, oh, hey, well, hell, the Japanese are indeed coming. Now, what they're coming with, he didn't know exactly, but he knew that they were coming down the slot, or they would be coming down the slot. He receives this intelligence and he prepares to maneuver his ships into the Savo Island area to do battle that very night. So again, he has not been spotted. The Japanese have no earthly idea that there's an American surface force anywhere near there, but Scott knows they're coming. So this is already kind of setting up like the reverse of Savo Island. You know, the Japanese knew where we were. We didn't know where they were. This is complete opposite of that. And this is important. At sundown, Scott orders his ships, all of them, to general quarters, determined not to be surprised by the Japanese like they were on August 8th. Now, it was abundantly clear what had happened on August 8th. You know, Admiral Scott and others, you know, they knew what had happened. They knew that it was a debacle. The United States, you know, citizenry did not, but the Navy did.
And we hadn't announced it yet. We kept it.
Right.
In fact, let's see, that happened in August. And then we didn't announce the sinking of those 4 cruisers until November, I think.
Right? I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up right now.
We didn't want to give the Japanese the benefit of knowing how much damage they had done at the Battle of Savo Island.
Exactly. And we didn't want to admit it to the U.S. populace either. So, and this is another important lesson learned from, so A, he puts his people at GQ, which are supposed to be at anyway. And B, what does he do, Bill? He launches his what? His
search planes, basically. All the aircraft that at the Battle of Savo Island ended up on fire because of aviation gasoline that those aircraft need, and became great bright beacons that the Japanese could aim their guns at. So if those airplanes aren't there, oh, by the way, where are you going to put those airplanes? This unsinkable aircraft carrier called Henderson Field on the island of Guadalcanal. So he offloads those airplanes because he doesn't want them to become targets like they had been at Savo.
And this pretty much becomes SOP after Savo. That's what American cruiser skippers do, especially when they're operating off the waters of Guadalcanal. They either launch them to the island or they launch them to do their actual jobs, which is search.
Again, I did this on a PBS live TV program where I talked about the fact those cruisers, the only reason those cruisers had those scout planes is because they were there before radar. They were, you know, for searching for targets and for gunfire direction, those pilots up in the air. Once you had radar, it kind of eliminated the need for those search planes because you could find the ships and use the radar for targeting, both missions that the airplanes had previously conducted. But cruisers would carry, and battleships would carry scout planes throughout the war. They were still aboard in 1945, but after that, we slowly got rid of them.
This is one of the aspects, though. This is one of those times where using the scout planes actually does come into play because Scott doesn't fully trust radar. He doesn't. He does after this, but he doesn't right yet. So he kicks those scout planes off of his ships and sends them to Guadalcanal. However, he does send a couple out to do their actual job, which is to search for the Japanese, because he knows the Japanese are coming. He doesn't exactly know where they're coming from, and he doesn't have a clear picture of what's coming. He just knows that they're coming. So he launches his scout planes, kicks them off the ship, and then sends the other ones out to go find the Japanese. Now, what couple of scout planes he still had, as I said, he launches them around 2,200 hours to go find the Japanese. And they do. They do find the Japanese. They do their job. They do that very, very thing. Now, to set this up, and this is an important part of the battle too, the night was a very clear night. And by clear night, I mean, it was cloudless pretty much. You know, there weren't any, there was nothing in the sky, that there was virtually no moon, or I don't think there was any moon at all that night specifically to add ambient light. And you would think with a clear night, you know, that the visibility would be good, but it was not. Because there was no moon, there was, and Bill, you can speak to this far better than I, standing watch on a bridge in the moonless night in the middle of the ocean, kind of dark out there.
Try doing it from a submarine submerged and you're looking out just through the periscope. You can't see anything. Now, For the airplanes that we're searching, they have bioluminescence that they might be able to see if the conditions are right. But again, it's impossible to see that from a ship until you get within a certain range. So the airplanes might have a much better chance of sighting these enemy ships from altitude than the surface ships did, just because of the bioluminescence. But I'm not sure that actually happened on this night.
Well, they did. The scout planes did, or at least one of them did, see the Japanese force come, whether it was bioluminescence or a shadow on the water, God knows, but they did spot something.
Right.
So as a result of, Scott knows that the Japanese are coming, he's got a pretty decent picture of what's coming at him right now. He sets his formation like this. Up in the beginning, up in the van of the formation are the destroyers Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey. Now, this is not the Laffey that's in South Carolina. This is the first USS Laffey, followed by the cruiser San Francisco. This is his flagship, the light cruiser Boise, the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, and the light cruiser Helena. And following Helena, bringing up the rear, are the destroyers Buchanan and McCalla. So, I mean, it's literally a straight line of United States Navy vessels.
Just like Trafalgar, you would have found.
Yeah, like Admiral Nelson, man. I mean, he's got them one after the other, like a flock of ducks.
Horatio Scott here. We're talking about.
Horatio Scott, that's right.
And now, again, getting to the dark night, these nights, you're in the middle of the ocean, are so dark, you can't even see the horizon. You don't know where the sea ends and the sky begins. And you're looking out. You don't even know if you got your binoculars pointed in the right direction. You don't know if you're looking down at the ocean or up at the sky, because you can't see the horizon. And just imagine that.
And just imagine knowing that somebody's coming at you to
kill you,
try to kill you. Yeah,
absolutely.
That'll make the heart race just a little bit there. The Japanese were completely unaware. Goto's forces were completely unaware that there were American surface vessels in the area. However, there was one Japanese man of war that actually did sight Scott's forces. It was a Japanese submarine, I-26.
26.
Yeah.
Veteran of Pearl Harbor, I-26. Now, I-26 was the submarine that launched one of the midget submarines into Pearl Harbor, and the torpedo officer on I-26 was Hashimoto, who later was commanding officer of I-28 that sunk the Indianapolis 3 years later. So this is a very noteworthy submarine that sighted these American ships.
Well, tell us what happens here. So the sub's on the surface.
Yeah.
So 26 is on the surface, and I'm not really sure exactly what she's doing there. She's just kind of hanging out, really.
No, she's looking for targets, and the tactic of the day was, once you sight the targets and you get into what you think is a reasonable firing position, you submerge and prosecute the attack submerged from periscope depth. And we had the same tactic, by the way. We the Americans did finally, eventually, in 1943, wisen up when we realized, holy cow, they can't see us on the surface. We're such a small target. Why are we submerging? Because when you submerge, you're pretty much limiting your speed to 3 knots. You can't run your diesel engines. You can't go fast. And that's a huge limitation. The problem when you're submerged is the enemy can easily outrun you and cause you to be out of firing position. But this submarine hadn't figured that out yet. The Japanese submarine force hadn't figured it out yet. So they did what everybody was doing in 1942, which is conduct the attack submerged. So you submerge, you limit it to 3 knots, and before you know it, holy cow, they've gone what we call over the hill, which means the enemy is going fast. They're not going 3 knots. They're going 20, 22 knots. And now they're out of torpedo range. And now I can't prosecute the attack, even if I know where you are. I've got to surface again, try to run at flank speed on the surface, regain firing position. And then in those days, they probably would have stupidly submerged again and then risk losing firing position. So that's what's going on here.
And that's exactly what happens. He sees them and then dives and then tries to make an attack, and poof, they're going. They're moving. I think he's doing like 22 knots. He's cooking. He's moving out there. At 22, this goes back to the scout plane. At 22:50 hours, San Francisco's scout plane, or one of them, spots and reports one large, two small vessels. Now, again, to your point, Bill, it's pitch black night. Mm-hmm. So he sees something. How again he sees it, God knows. And he cannot identify exactly what types of ships they are, but he sees them and reports them 16 miles from Guadalcanal. Based on this report, Scott executes a turn. And he knows where the Japanese are coming now. He knows their formation. He knows their disposition.
Their course. Yep.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
He knows what's going on. He executes a turn in order to cross the Japanese T. He knows it's a surface force coming at him. He's in charge of a surface force. This goes back to what you were saying in the beginning here, Bill. He is going to execute the classic, or he's going to try and execute the classic naval maneuver, bringing all of his guns to bear on just a small portion to where the Japanese can only respond with a small portion.
In enfilade, that's right. Yeah.
So the Japanese formation is led by the heavy cruiser Aoba, the Furitaka, and the Kinugasa. Now these are, well, the Kinugasa for sure and the Aoba were both at Savo Island. So these are veterans of the Savo fight. The destroyers Fubuki and I can't even pronounce this bad boy.
Hatsuyuki.
There we go. are holding screen. They're on either side of the formation here, but by and large, the main targets, the cruisers, are in a column, much like Scott's cruisers, although Scott is now beginning to cross the T on this Japanese formation. At around 23:32 hours, so this is just shortly before midnight, Helena's...
We're talking local time here. Right.
Correct. Yes. Helena's SG radar. This is the newfangled radar. Helena's SG radar picks up the Japanese ships. Boise and Salt Lake City also picked up the Japanese on radar. Why didn't San Francisco pick them up? Because the radar was off, because he turned it off. Scott is receiving, Helena and Salt Lake City and Boise are all saying, hey, there's something on our radar screens here. They're coming. We know they're here. Here they come. And they're all sending these reports in at one time. And Admiral Scott is confused by all these reports because he's getting three separate pictures of the event. And
they're probably reporting three different targets. So he doesn't know how many targets, or, it's what's called deconfliction, where you try to take the organic sensor information from different ships. Normally what you do is you lay them on a maneuvering board or plotting board and say, okay, these two ships, this target that they're both reporting, that's the same guy. But now this guy over here that's being reported, it's a different ship, right? So you get some assessment of how many ships and what their course is, what their line of bearing is. But he's getting a bunch of confused reports, and he doesn't know how many enemy, where they are exactly, and so on.
Right. And to top that all off, with everything you just said, he doesn't trust radar to begin with. So he's not exactly, is this the Japanese that these guys are seeing, or is this, a rowboat, or is this Savo Island they're picking up on radar? He's not 100% sure. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and this is very, very important. This is going to play a role again in another naval battle in November, on Friday the 13th, actually, is that this generation of U.S. admirals, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, didn't understand radar that well. They didn't trust it, and they did not want to put a lot of faith into the machine because it was new. It was something that they hadn't been trained on. Right.
Yeah. Are you going to risk your life on this unproven technology?
Right.
Or are you going to be cautious and wait for the technology to be proven before you risk the outcome of an entire battle on it? And there's arguments for both sides. Their arguments say early adopters that master the technology are going to win. They're going to use it to their advantage and win. And then there's other arguments that say, don't let go with one hand until you've got a firm grip with the other.
Right.
And so we have our tried and true tactics. Don't let go of those until you know with absolute certainty that this new stuff works. And he was one of the latter guys.
He was, but he's a convert. He becomes a convert pretty quickly, because he's getting all these reports in from his other cruisers, and finally he's like, all right, fine, the hell with it, turn it on. And he orders San Francisco's radar to be turned on, and lo and behold, when her radar warms up, what do? At 23:45 hours, San Francisco picks up the enemy on radar, and finally, Admiral Scott believes what he's being told. And again, it's not that he was like, oh, you guys are full of crap, I don't believe you. He couldn't put it all together in his mind at that time.
And he picks up these ships at like a reasonable range of 20,000 yards, right?
Nope. By the time he flips on that radar, the Japanese are 5,000 yards away from San Francisco. 2.5
miles. That's like nothing. Right?
That
is danger close. The aviators laugh at us, wet warriors, the surface and submarine guys, at the ranges that we talk about as being scary. But 2,500 yards is scary.
On a cruiser? Yes.
Yeah. So this is not good. No. Unless they react very quickly,
which is what they do, because he's got his people prepared. He's got, for his fault and not, trusting the radar, he's got his boys ready to go.
But again, to set the stage, most of these kinds of engagements, you want to begin firing at a range. Remember, these are cruisers. The cruisers with the 6 and 8 inch guns, they had an effective range of 10, 12. The rounds could go much further than that, but I'm saying effective range, 10, 12,000 yards. Okay. So that's where you generally practice, commence firing. So if you're a crew member on a ship like the Helena and you see the enemy at 5,000 yards, you're wondering, what the heck are we doing?
Yeah.
And in fact, one ensign says, what does he say?
Yes, an ensign and radar plot aboard Helena. He's watching the Japanese come. Oh, and by the way, right after San Francisco's radar kicks on, lookouts on the Helena are visually seeing the Japanese now. They're that close.
And they're exactly where the radar says they're going to be.
Exactly.
Which is another thing that allows Admiral Scott to be more confident that it actually works.
Exactly. An ensign and radar plot aboard Helena is watching the Japanese literally inch closer across his radar screen, turns around and asks the ship's navigator, quote, what the hell are we going to do? Board them.
So he thought we were going to be throwing out the grappling hooks here and pulling the ships together and boarding them with swords. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you do when you're getting inside 2,500 yards. And so, this is like, you studied these ancient techniques, but you never thought you were going to actually get that close to an enemy in what was then modern warfare of 1942.
They're very, very close. Finally, again, there's been no orders to open fire. Captain Gilbert Hoover, who is the captain aboard USS Helena, he sees the radar screen. I say he doesn't leave the bridge, but he's up on the bridge. He's getting these same reports, and now he can visually see the enemy at the same time. He's like, the hell with this. We're done. He, without orders from Admiral Scott, decides to open fire at 23:46. At that moment, USS Helena, let loose with all 15 of her 6-inch guns at one time. 15 6-inch guns and one salvo. Bagoon.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a lot of lead.
That is. And this is a big upcheck for Hoover. But I'm not the historian here, Seth, but his name sticks in my mind with another event we'll talk about on a future episode, something to do with Juneau. But we'll talk about that at a later date. But today, Captain Hoover does a good job.
Indeed, he does. He orders Helena to open fire, and she does that very thing. Aboard the Japanese cruisers, Admiral Goto finally sights the American formation at a range of, now, I say finally, he sighted the Americans before we ever sighted them. He sighted us at 10,000, or his lookout sighted us at 10,000 yards. However, he was concerned that the ships may be friendly, so he ordered a turn and a flash of recognition signals. As the Japanese signalman,
just if I could though, Seth, when it's night like this and you see a ship on the horizon, if you're lucky enough, oftentimes you don't. What you really see is a blob. And remember that the Japanese were also trying to land forces on Guadalcanal and resupply their troops. And so he doesn't know that we're in the vicinity, but he does know there are other Japanese transports and other ships trying to land forces on Guadalcanal, which is, you're going to say, what is he, wacko? No, this actually makes sense when it's thought of in context.
Yep, perfect sense, because he didn't know. I mean, he knew, as you said, that there were other Japanese ships out there. He wanted to make sure that those
They don't
were
fire on
not.
his own troops.
Right.
Mhm.
As Aoba, which is their Japanese flagship, begins to turn to flash that message at the American ships, literally, she's into her turn, maybe 30 seconds, and Helena's shells just light her up, just smack the living bejesus out of her. Back aboard Helena, all her guns were firing at this time, but not in salvo, and this is just damn cool. Each turret and each gun within the turret was operating almost independently in what was called, quote, and this is from the Helena report, automatic continuous mode.
Yeah, in infantry tactics, this is called fire at will.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you to pick a target and fire as quickly as you can rather than trying to coordinate the salvo with all the guns at the same time on the ship.
Yep. You just load and fire. And and each turret, you know, what the listener needs to understand is that each turret and to a point each gun, and you're talking Helena's got 15, what did I say, 15 guns. So she's got 5 turrets, because in each turret there's 3 guns. And there's gun crews for each one of those guns. And that's guys who are loading the shells, loading the powder, closing the breech, firing the weapons. It's, you know, they can be controlled
together
synchronously. But they can also be controlled locally. And by locally, I mean within the turret if need be. And that's essentially what's going on here.
That's true for the triple turrets, and even in a battleship with those 16-inch guns. Each of those barrels, in effect, can be fired independently, or they can be fired in salvo.
The Helena is doing that very thing. She's firing independently, and she's not the only one, mind you, but I'm just going to focus on her because this is just damn cool. She is lighting the Japanese up with such rapidity that, I mean, the results were unbelievable. Helena's gun crews had their weapons loaded and fired so fast that the Japanese later believed, their reports after the battle later believed, that the Americans had a cruiser with automatic weapons. They called the American cruisers, Helena of that class, they called them the machine gun cruisers, which is just badass, man.
6-inch guns in triple guns in a turret that are like a machine gun. That's some pretty good firing.
That is some serious firepower. I'm going to show some footage in the video version of this that of that classic cruiser. Unfortunately, it's them firing in broad daylight, but if you look close, you can see the muzzle flashes coming from their guns, and they are firing in this automatic continuous mode, and it really does look like automatic weapons fire. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. So aboard the Salt Lake City, now can't forget that there are other ships in line aside from Helena.
And then this is a heavy cruiser, not a light cruiser, so it has 8-inch guns, not 6-inch guns.
This is a big girl. Yeah, this is a big girl. Her 8-inch guns open fire on Aoba, on the Japanese cruiser Aoba, from only 4,000 yards away. Her second salvo smashed Aoba, and Salt Lake City's gun directors reported no splashes, all hits. At that close of a range, I don't think you're going to miss if you tried to. So much so that there was an actual quote. I forget exactly who said it, but there was a quote. Ensign Weems aboard the USS McCalla says of the gunfight as he's watching it unfold, he says, quote, "I felt wildly exultant joy in watching us let them have so much at such murderous range. If you stop and think, 2,500 to 3,000 yards is point blank for big guns, and it is. You can hardly miss, even if you wanted to."
And they didn't want to.
No. No, they did not. What happens to all the other American cruisers in line? They're all opening fire. At this point, Scott never really gave it.
There's a bit of a melee here where the destroyers peel off, and we're skipping some details on how the melee, how things unraveled from the formation standpoint. But things did not unravel from the gunfire standpoint.
No, and no, that's very important, that things kind of did get a little confusing there, and ships started to basically, they started to peel out of formation. Everybody's shooting independently. San Francisco opens fire on a destroyer from 4,500 yards away at this time. The entire American column is engulfed in this gunfight. Every single ship in the American column is firing, and this is midnight-ish, and you can imagine what that must have looked like on the surface. Just the gun flashes, the tracers, everything that's going back and forth across the water. It had to be both terrifying, mesmerizing, and massively confusing to anybody aboard any of these ships. The rate of fire that the American cruiser and destroyer formation is pouring on the Japanese at this time absolutely stuns the Japanese. They had no earthly clue that we could put out that much fire that quickly and that accurately. Now, granted, again, they're so close they can hardly miss. But I mean, these ships are taking a pounding.
And 3 ships were burning, and of course, 3 Japanese ships. And of course, that makes the targeting even easier when they're aflame.
Absolutely. Despite Admiral Scott's initial mistrust of radar, which we've already talked about, he orders his ships to fire using the technology due to the fact that the fire was so heavy that he could not monitor the battle visually. He couldn't see what the hell was going on. And within minutes, all American ships were doing just that, adjusting their fire with radar, walking their shells into their targets with sniper-like accuracy. I mean, they are just pounding the Japanese.
And the way you do that, by the way, is on the radar, you can actually see the splash if you've missed. And so all you need to do is close that splash onto the target, the radar return of the target and the radar return of the splash. You adjust the gunfire targeting so that that splash intercepts the ship target.
And that's precisely what is going on here. 4 minutes after opening fire, USS Boise, which is the same class as USS Helena, had expended 300 rounds from her main battery. Think about that. 300 rounds in 4 minutes, 6-inch guns. That is some serious shooting. 3 Japanese ships are afire at this time. Japanese cruiser Aoba had been hit at least 24 times and was afire. 2 main battery turrets were destroyed. Her main battery director was destroyed. Searchlights, catapults, and several boilers. God knows how many Japanese sailors are dead and dying and severely wounded aboard this ship because she's just taken a beating. The firing was so severe that Scott lost control of the events. And this is, you can kind of understand why. We've made a big point of the volume of fire that the United States Navy ships are pouring on the Japanese right now. Again, it's nighttime. So, Bill, you've seen gun flashes at night. They will temporarily blind you, much less thousands of them, at one time.
Well, he actually orders ceasefire at this point, I think.
He does.
And it's when you think you've lost control of situational awareness and you don't know where the bad guys are and where the friendlies are, and you can't see anything anymore, and the radar picture is all confused because now you got a bit of a melee. So you can see targets on the radar, but you don't know which of those radar targets is us and which is them. At some point you say, we need to regroup, ceasefire, maybe get back in formation and coordinate our fire a little bit better. For better or worse, nobody heard them. Or at least if they heard them, nobody obeyed because they didn't cease fire.
I think the latter is the more appropriate answer.
Maybe so. Yeah.
I mean, the Japanese, we were talking, they were so damn close that I think it's a obviously proven thing that they did hear the order to cease fire, but they're like, no. I mean, you could practically reach out and touch these guys. They're that damn close. They never really did cease fire. Scott,
honestly, if that report went out over a TBS talk between ships, this is a very, very loud battle too. So again, benefit of the doubt, it would be really hard to hear an order like that to be received. But
agreed.
But he's not the only guy in this war who pretended not to hear an order to disengage. So
chesty puller, but
chesty puller.
But I mean, you can understand the confusion. You can understand why he, as you said, was trying to get his hands on the situation that at that time, Admiral Scott felt like was starting to slip from his control. It was clear that we were winning at this stage, but it was also clear to him that things were not what he wanted them to be. Japanese cruiser Furitaka took several hits, more than likely from San Francisco and Salt Lake City because of the damage. It was a little bit bigger than a 6-inch gun could inflict. Her turrets were hit and at least one was destroyed, and she took hits in her torpedo tubes. And this is a bad thing because this ship carries the long lance
torpedoes, which is the most powerful torpedo in the world. And they may not explode but they'll burn. Even if they just burn, it's really, really bad.
And this is what happens here.
Mhm.
The torpedoes, or at least the launch or something, is set afire in that general vicinity. And she too becomes a beacon of light for American ships to shoot at, and they do just that very thing. Salt Lake City radar set sweeps the area at that time and detected, and this is a little bit erroneous, but she, quote, detected all enemy targets afire. Not all Japanese ships were afire, but the ones that were seen pretty much were. This thing goes down. It starts rather abruptly, even though Scott knows the Japanese are coming. It starts rather abruptly, and it kind of ends pretty quickly. This is not, your Jutland style all afternoon type of a thing. This is a boom, and it starts, and boom, it's over. By 02:45, the battle is over. And
a little more than almost 3 hours, right?
Yeah,
from start to finish.
Yeah, and in between there, and people are thinking, wow, 3 hours of shooting. It wasn't 3 hours solid shooting.
No,
it was. There's a lot of maneuvering going on. There's a lot of, it's not all constant fire. So there are breaks in the action here and there. The Americans had beaten the crap out of a Japanese cruiser and destroyer force, eventually sending the cruiser Furitaka and the destroyer Fubuki to the bottom. Aoba, which is Goto's flagship, was heavily damaged, but she limps away. Goto, by the way, is killed. He is killed in action here. The Japanese admiral is killed. Japanese casualties are estimated to have been around 450 men killed, and another 100 or so captured the next morning. And these guys that are captured are the ones that are either blown off of the ships or those that survived, the sinkings of those vessels. We do not get out of this scot-free, and that scot-free is a poor choice in terms, seeing as how Admiral Scott was the commander, but that was totally unintended. But Bill, what are the casualties on the United States side here?
We had 163 men killed too, and several hundred injured. So we suffered, but again, 450 men killed on the Japanese side. That's, let's just call it a 3-to-1 ratio. The ratio exchange rate was much worse during Savo, with us being the losers on that side than in this. So this wasn't as big a victory for us as Savo was a loss, but it was a victory. And at this point, we're happy to have any victory.
Any victory is exactly right. Now, the personnel losses are obviously tragic, but we also lose the destroyer Duncan. The Japanese sink the destroyer Duncan, and the cruiser Boise that we mentioned that was putting out all that lead. She's hit severely. She's hit very hard. She takes some significant Japanese shell fire damage. I believe she takes a torpedo off the top of my head. I can't recall, but I think she does. She does not sink, but she takes heavy damage. Salt Lake City is lightly damaged, as is the destroyer Fahrenholt. Fahrenholt actually takes some pretty heavy damage too. But as you were saying, the credit side for the United States is significantly heavy in that we sink a couple of Japanese ships. More importantly, we turn them around. We force them to withdraw.
But while we're doing this, for better or worse, the Japanese succeed in getting their troops ashore at Guadalcanal. Exactly. So the Marines do have to deal with the extra troops that made it ashore. However, because of this victory, that faucet is slowly being turned off.
Right.
And the Japanese end up having to modify the tactics that they use to get further reinforcements ashore to face Marines in what would also become the Americal division that we spoke about at the beginning.
Right. And it's 100% correct. And it's very important in that, this is, as you were saying a minute ago, this is our first surface victory off the shores of Guadalcanal. And
we've had carrier victories before.
Right.
But this is the first classic surface, Midway too, for carrier victory.
Oh, for sure.
But this is the first classic old style surface ship victory. And to revisit this crossing the T thing, in modern eras of non-sailing ships, the Japanese used crossing the T tactic very effectively. In fact, it was Togo himself at the Battle of Tsushima in the Tsushima Straits in the Russo-Japanese War. Jutland, you mentioned Jutland.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big crossing the T battle that went on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
This one, Cape Esperance, but this would not be the last time we're going to see the crossing the T battle. And in fact, the most famous maybe the last time it's ever used is in a battle. We'll talk about the way things are going in an episode in 3 years. When we talk about Leyte Gulf, and it's the Battle of Surigao Strait.
Surigao Strait, yeah, which is a cool battle. That's the revenge of the Pearl Harbor battle wagons, for those who don't know.
Yeah.
But Cape Esperance is important, and it's also not as important as we would like to believe. It's important because, A, as you were saying, it's a victory, and it is. It's a clear American victory. B, we do exact some revenge for Savo Island. And while, their listeners or viewers are sitting there going, revenge, what the hell's that got to do with anything? That's huge for the sailors of the U.S. Navy right now, especially the surface Navy, because these guys got humiliated. They got slaughtered. They don't have a whole lot. Well, a great many of them didn't have a whole hell of a lot of faith in their leadership after Savo. And you can't blame them. You can't blame the guys. And this restores a lot of pride to the U.S. Navy. Admiral Scott is, given the moniker of hero of the battle. And, he was task force commander. So he was the guy that orchestrated the vast majority of this, even though a lot of it did start to slip out of his hands at one time. He is responsible for it. And it
proves this newfangled radar these kids want to use actually works. That's the way I increasingly talk in my dotage. So,
and you're not the only one. I always say things to my wife that I hear other people say, and I say, as the kids say, and I'm not referring to my children either, but Admiral Scott, who is initially hesitant about radar, after this becomes a big proponent of the usage of radar. And you're going to hear about Admiral Scott again in November. You're going to hear about him again other times, but you're going to hear about him again in November. And his senior officer in that battle is a guy named Daniel Callahan. And Callahan is kind of like Scott was here. He's not a big proponent of radar. Scott tries to basically
make him a believer,
and doesn't work out quite that way.
No.
But again, back to Cape Esperance. It's big, and then it restores a lot of the faith in American leadership, naval leadership. It restores pride and morale in the U.S. Navy. It does turn away this bombardment force that the Japanese are sending out here. It does not stop the troop convoy. That troop convoy does indeed unload their supplies and their people, up there around Taivu Point or wherever it was that they put ashore. And these guys that they unload do play a part in the battle that's coming up at the end of this month, at the end of October. But it was a good feeling for the U.S. Navy after this battle that they proved that they could and indeed did beat the stuffings out of a Japanese surface force here.
Yep. And we're about halfway, 3 months into this campaign of Guadalcanal. It's going to last roughly 6 months. And we're now gaining confidence that we can actually succeed in resupplying the ground troops, because we realize you can't win this battle without air cover, where we've got that pretty well in hand. You need control of the seas to resupply the ground troops. And we're slowly creeping back control of the seas. And then once we get those two, it's duking it out between Army and Marines and the Japanese forces that are ashore in Guadalcanal. And that's what is to come.
Yeah, that's exactly what is to come. And if you get the sense of everything that we've been talking about the last 2 or 3 episodes, everything is kind of slowly building. And we always talk about the Japanese their quest for the decisive battle. Everything is slowly building to that very thing, at least on land. There's going to be another carrier battle in another couple of weeks, the Battle of Santa Cruz. There's still some more surface shooting to do, actually quite a bit, in November. So it's slowly building to this tipping point. The campaign is building to this tipping point, and it all starts to unfold here in the next couple of weeks. As Operation Shoestring, as we called it, We're getting more supplies, we're getting more people, we're getting more ships. More airplanes. The American industrial force is starting to show its weight here. And the thing is the Japanese, some of them realize it and some of them don't. And so they're determined to get it done.
We're in October. What did Yamamoto say about how quickly they need to win this war? 6 months. 6 months. And we're well beyond 6 months at this point.
You're at 11
Yamamoto's viewpoint. This isn't the way I had planned it.
And he starts to push pretty hard for that decisive action, which is going to come at the end of this month. So while this was a relatively quick one by our recent history,
over an hour, right? That's quick for us, I guess, huh?
It's an important event, and it's a fun one to talk about. At least from the United States perspective, it's a fun one to talk about. It's an event that frankly doesn't get as much of the limelight as Savo does for negative reasons, or the November battles do for both negative and positive reasons. But it is indeed, one of those actions off Guadalcanal where it plays a role into things that follow afterwards. Well, Bill, you got anything else you want to say, or are we?
No, I just can't help but think of my Uncle Joe as we talk about this Guadalcanal battles and the Maricel division. He was a combat engineer, and he was one of my heroes when I was growing up. So I'm so happy we're talking about this.
Well, we're going to definitely talk about him and the actions that his people and the United States Marine Corps did on Guadalcanal here in our next episode, where we talk about the climactic land battle of the campaign, which of course is the October battle for Henderson Field.
The only other thing I'll say about my Uncle Joe is, one of the reasons I was in the Navy is my Uncle Joe saying, "Join the Navy, you'll never have to sleep in mud." And I just remember that sense. So, I guess he had to do a lot of sleeping in mud in Guadalcanal. So
I would imagine so.
Shaped my entire future. And I never slept in mud on my submarine. So he was right about that.
Amen to that. Well, with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast, and give us a rating and review. And thank you to those who have done so already. We certainly do appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this and any of our other episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Also, look us up on Facebook, like and subscribe to our page there as well. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And once again, my name is Seth Paradin. I want to thank you very much for listening. Bill?
And I'm Bill Tody, retired Navy captain. Happy to be here. Happy you're listening, and take care.
All right. Thank you, guys.